Hi, everyone. Thank you for having us. We're going to present our master thesis project. My name is Henrik, and I study computer science and specialize in AI.
Yeah, and my name is Kristoffer. I also study computer science and specialize in artificial intelligence.
And our master thesis is called Positional Encoding Augmented GAN for the assessment of wind flow for pedestrian comfort in urban areas. And our team consists of people from SINTEF, Nobleflow, Norwegian Open AI Lab, and Brain NTNU, which is a student organization that Kristoffer and I work with.
Yeah. And this master thesis is written in collaboration with Nobleflow, so we need to introduce them first. Nobleflow is a spin-off company from the University of Stavanger and was first started back in 2018. They work with aerodynamics and wind engineering, where they design new simulation tools for their customers. And Nobleflow is delivering wind simulations by using something called computational fluid dynamics, short CFD, which is basically solving iteratively something called Reynolds average Navier-Stokes equations. I will not go closer into the details about these equations, but the problem with this method is that it is very costly to perform for big geometries, as well as taking a lot of time to compute. And what we try to do for Nobleflow in this project is find a way to use machine learning to train a model to perform predictions on how these wind simulations should look like. Yeah.
Yes, and we have formulated our prediction problem as such. So given a 3D geometry of a building, we simplify it to a 2D quasi-image. And we then want to learn the mapping function between domain X and Y, which is the geometry and the simulation results. The methods we use include models such as conditional GANs and autoencoders, which Kristoffer will talk more about later. But essentially, we solve this problem as an image-to-image translation task between the two domains. And for our thesis, we've been experimenting with 5 datasets. That is, only walls, single buildings, 2 buildings, 2 buildings with varying height, and lastly, buildings from a real urban city environment. And the last dataset was generated by performing simulations on 300 square meter patches of Oslo. And this problem presents a much more realistic scenario and increases the complexity drastically from the earlier mentioned datasets. And both the geometry and the targets are 256 by 250 pixels. In the target, each pixels represent the magnitude of the velocity vector in x, y, and z direction, which is what we want to predict.
Yeah. So we will not go very detailed into our methods, but we will explain the most important parts. So we use generative adversarial networks, or GANs, which for those of you who don't know too much about them, it is essentially 2 networks who place against each other in a minimax 2-player game, where the generator, which in our case predicts the wind simulations, tries to capture the underlying data distribution from the dataset, which hopefully encaptures the Navier-Stokes equations, while the discriminator judges the real simulations and the generator output and tries to assign them a probability of being real or fake simulations. And vanilla GANs generates their predictions from random noise. And that is why we use conditional GANs, so that our model can condition on the buildings we input. The 2 types of GANs that we have experimented mostly with is called pix-to-pix and cycle GAN. And you can read more about them yourself if you're interested. But what these types of models have in common is that they are trained in an adversarial way, where we have the generator trying to fool the discriminator. And for comparison, we also try to use just the generator from these networks, which is an autoencoder called UNet. And instead of performing adversarial training, we perform normal supervised learning using only the L1 distance as the objective. We also added some additional extensions to these models, which Henrik will talk about.
Yeah, so one of the most significant challenges of training GANs is the lack of stability when updating the generator and the discriminator's weights. And in order to maintain this stability, we extended our model to use a weight normalization technique called spectral normalization in the discriminator to slow down learning. We also experimented with injecting positional information such as SDF, short for sign distance function, and chord conv. In the SDF, each pixel represents the distance to the closest building of that pixel and is applied as an additional input channel, while chord conv adds 2 additional channels with X and Y coordinates, both illustrated in the slide. And lastly, we explored 2 different attention mechanisms, CBAM and self-attention, in both the generator and discriminator. And our hypothesis here was that if the model learns to attend on more critical parts of the simulation, it will be able to make more accurate predictions.
So the results. The results are presented from the third dataset with multiple buildings with a fixed height. Here we observed a significant improvement when we added spectral normalization, and we saw a much more stable training process of the network. By applying this, we observed around 10% drop in all evaluation metrics, as you can see in the table on the left-hand side. Then by adding the positional information, we saw that it actually helped a lot, and the model were able to predict a much more accurate simulations, which we will review more on the next slide. The different attention mechanisms did not have as much impact on the results as we hoped for. But if there were some improvements, it was when we added the attention in the generator and combined it with the positional information.
Yeah, and here's a few examples of our results from Pix-to-Pix cycle GAN unit. And we observed that the models are able to predict that the flow in the upstream region, which is on the left-hand side, decelerates due to the presence of the buildings. And also we want to see that the flow accelerates around the buildings, and in particular in the passage between buildings. And then that a wake with a low velocity is generated in the downstream region, which means behind the building. And as a final part of our project, we want to determine whether or not a neural network-based architecture is capable of generating accurate enough wind flow predictions for an interactive tool. And we therefore integrated our models in a web application where one could make predictions on a selected area of a map. And what also differs from our previous experiments is that we now classify the wind velocities into different classes in order to create comfort maps. A pedestrian wind comfort map illustrates the pedestrians' annual wind conditions at ground level. To produce these maps, you combine wind simulations from 8 different wind inlet directions, statistical weather data, and a set of defined comfort criteria. And as in Lawson's wind comfort criteria, we have 5 classes: sitting, standing, strolling, business walking, and uncomfortable. And having these comfort maps are crucial when prototyping new buildings. And when we compare the prediction time of the neural networks with the time necessary for CFD simulations, we see that we can rely on CFD when creating such an interactive tool. So when performing a CFD simulations to calculate a comfort map, it takes about 1 to 2 hours on good hardware, while our GANs uses a couple of seconds when running on a GPU. And we believe that this shows great promise for using neural network-based architectures for an interactive design tool. And we look forward to seeing further work within this domain.
Okay, so that was all we had. Thanks everyone for listening. And if you have any questions, feel free to ask either here or on Slack afterwards. So thank you.